potential predator, an enraged father, one family slain, another destroyed in the process. This is the story of Major John Kaler, a man that brutally attacked his neighbors while claiming he was just trying to protect the ones he loved. And yet, the story of Kaler's attack isn't as clear-cut as you might expect. It all started with an accusation that was never proven, but regardless, it led to several innocent people losing their lives. The question we must ask ourselves is this: how far would we go to protect the ones we love? As this story unfolds, we'll attempt to unpack the events that led to Kaler asking himself this question, and finding out that the answer was more violent than he could have ever imagined. 41-year-old Kenna Guardipe lived in the 500 block of West Brown Avenue in Kellogg, Idaho. With a population of just over 2,000 people, this tiny town situated in the scenic Silver Valley of Shoshone County was probably just what Kenna needed, considering how difficult her life had been. She lived in the bottom half of a duplex with her father, 65-year-old Kenneth Guardipe, and her children, Devin and Aiken, who were 18 and 16 years old respectively. Despite what you might think, Devin and Aiken weren't technically part of the Guardipe family. Their family name was listed as Smith, suggesting that their father had been in the picture long enough to give them his own family name. However, he abandoned his family at some point, forcing Kenna to raise the children on her own. According to a statement made by her mother, Jerry Silva, Kenna had basically fallen off the map some months ago. She hadn't heard from her since the beginning of 2023, suggesting that she was running from something, or perhaps someone. Desperate and alone, Kenna eventually made her way back to her father in Kellogg sometime during 2023. Kenneth was more than happy to take his daughter and grandchildren in, but no matter how much he tried, he couldn't make up for the lack of a father figure in Devin and Aiken's lives. Even so, the family got settled in the ground floor apartment. They even formed a respectful relationship with the Kalers, who'd lived in the apartment above for years. The two families shared a backyard, which meant that they interacted quite frequently, and there had never been any signs of tension between them. But underneath the surface, there was a darkness that would burst out so suddenly that it would change the sleepy town forever. Part of it had to do with Devin, who'd had some serious trouble adjusting to society and learning how to behave appropriately around women. But as we'll soon reveal, the perpetrator of this crime had a ticking time bomb of violence within him that was just waiting to go off. Anyone that looked at Major John Kaler could tell that he hadn't exactly lived a normal life. With the word savage tattooed on his forehead, it was clear that he was the sort of man that could snap at any moment. Despite that, there was no indication that he was abusive towards his family. In fact, if appearances are anything to go by, the Kalers seemed to be living a perfectly happy life. Kaler had found himself a job at the local mine, which brought in enough money to support a family of 4. His wife, Kaylee, loved her husband dearly, as did their 3 young children, whose names have been withheld from the public. It's important to note that Kaler had a dark past. His criminal history was by no means spotless, showing a reckless streak that led to him being caught with narcotic substances in his possession at one point. He was able to plead the charges down to a misdemeanor, but the mark on his record, along with his face tattoo, meant that he didn't have many employment options. Born and raised in Shoshone County, Kaler might have made his way to Kellogg because of the local gold mine. It provided well-paying job opportunities to anyone willing to live in such a far-flung locale. And just like Kenna, Kaler probably needed the peace and quiet of Kellogg, Idaho, as he tried to clean himself up. His family was likely his saving grace, and he would have done anything to protect them. Idaho's gun laws allowed anyone to carry a concealed firearm, and that's exactly what Kaler did. He wasn't going to take any chances when it came to protecting his wife and kids, but it was almost like he was looking for an opportunity to use that weapon. Or perhaps his past altercations with the seedier side of life had shown him that nowhere is truly safe. Either way, the fact that Devin Smith lived just downstairs made it all but inevitable that a confrontation would occur. Growing up without a father is never easy, but Devin Smith might have had significant personality issues holding him back. People that knew him say that he struggled with a learning disability, so there's a chance he felt extremely isolated in the small community of Kellogg. His brother Aiken didn't seem to face such problems. By all accounts, he was a well-adjusted member of the community. No one seemed to mind his presence as much as Devon's, but there was a good reason why people were wary of the older brother. No one knows why the boy's father was out of the picture. Considering the social issues Devon experienced, there's a chance that he was extremely abusive. But whatever the case may be, Devon never really learned how to behave around other people, especially women. He also seemed to have an obsessive personality. According to Daisy Sawyer, one of his classmates, Devon frequently harassed her at school. This could have involved anything from stalking to outright sexual advances. The details are unclear, but the point is this. Devon's understanding of consent was dubious at best, and it led to him behaving extremely inappropriately with the people around him. He'd developed a reputation at school for being extremely inappropriate. It's likely that this involved incidents of indecent exposure, since Devon was eventually put into a special program to help troubled teens. The program seems to have worked, since we found photographic evidence of Devon graduating from high school, and yet his personality issues remained unchecked, and it's possible that his mother and grandfather didn't do enough to hold him back. Considering that the Gardepis had only moved into the bottom floor of the duplex just a few weeks before the incident, they might have had to move because of Devon's behavior. Either way, shortly after graduating, Devon was looking forward to a long summer of relaxation. It's unclear whether he wanted to go to college, and the town of Kellogg didn't offer many prospects to an unadjusted teen with a history of getting handsy with women. In the apartment above, Major John Kaler was on the lookout for even the tiniest hint that his family was unsafe. This made the duplex apartment like a tinderbox just waiting to be set ablaze. And as it turns out, Devon's troubling behavior was the spark that lit the flame, creating a raging inferno that would burn both families down. On June 13, 2023, Kaylee Kaler was in the garden with her young daughters when she saw something horrific. The Gardepis' bathroom had a window that looked out onto the backyard, and in that moment, Kaylee witnessed Devon standing there completely naked with his genitals in his hands. He appeared to be pleasuring himself while looking directly at Kaylee and her daughters, who were all under the age of 10 at the time. This incident left Kaylee feeling understandably shocked, so she immediately told her husband and posted to Facebook about the whole ordeal. The next step was to tell the police, which the Kalers did without delay. They filed a report, prompting authorities to visit the duplex and conduct an investigation. Despite Kaylee's repeated claims that Devon was a child predator, the police apparently didn't find enough evidence to initiate court proceedings. No charges were filed, so the matter didn't really go anywhere. This left Kaler feeling absolutely infuriated. In his view, the police hadn't done their job, and his daughters were being forced to live next door to a dangerous predator. His thoughts strayed to his gun, and how he could use it to end the threat once and for all. On June 15th, the Kaler family celebrated Father's Day. They probably tried their best to act like everything was normal, but the incident must have left a layer of thick tension in the air. Kaler was in a dark mood. He couldn't get over the incident and the threat it implied. In the apartment below, the Gardepis likely didn't celebrate Father's Day at all. There was no father in the picture, and the recent visit from the police had probably left them feeling unsettled. Kenna looked at her boy Devon, thought about the countless times he'd been accused of behaving inappropriately, and felt the need to protect him. Devon didn't have anyone but her, his brother, and the grandfather. Maybe if she'd done something just then, the following event would have played out differently. But unfortunately, no one really did anything to stop what was to come. And 3 days later, the smoldering rage in Kaler's chest finally exploded. On the evening of June 18th, Kaler came back home from a Sunday shift at the mine. The past 5 days had been absolute torture for him. It's difficult to imagine how his thoughts must have turned to the predator living downstairs, a predator that could do anything to his little girls while he was at work. As soon as he got home, he picked up his .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun and attached it to his belt. He then joined his family outside in the garden where that horrific incident had occurred 5 days ago. There's a chance that he brought his gun along in case Devin tried to repeat his past actions, but the 18-year-old neighbor was nowhere to be found. Even so, standing at the scene of the crime must have sent Kaler over the edge, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. He marched over to his neighbors and knocked on the door, prompting Kenna to answer. As soon as he saw her, he launched into an angry rant about how she was protecting a child predator. He brought up the accusations against Devin once again, hoping that his mother would have something to say for him. However, Kenna wasn't about to throw her son under the bus. No matter what he'd done, he was still her son, and she'd do anything she could to protect him. The commotion brought Kenneth to the door, who tried to calm things down, all while pretending like Devin hadn't done anything. According to Kaler, there was no remorse from their side, nor did they offer an apology. They didn't even acknowledge the incident, prompting Kaler to fly into an even bigger rage. And then, the Guardy piece said something that pushed Kaler over the edge. When the perpetrator asked them what they were going to do about Devin, they responded that there wasn't anything they could do. Upon hearing this, Kaler decided that he'd have to be the one to do something about it after all. At 7:20 p.m., the Shoshone County Sheriff's Office received a call from someone living on West Brown Avenue saying they'd heard multiple shots fired. They also said that several people appeared to have been killed.
Within seconds of being on scene, Kaler told him he had just shot his 4 neighbors. Idaho State Police Detective Justin Klitsch also spoke. He told the court he read Kaler his Miranda rights about a minute after they sat down.
Police arrived and saw a gruesome scene. Kenna and Kenneth were both lying dead in the backyard, their bodies riddled with bullets. Realizing that this was just the first piece of the puzzle, police decided to enter the residence where they found 16-year-old Aiken dead of a gunshot wound to the temple. They headed to the bedroom where they found Devin behind the door with several gunshot wounds to his head as well. And somewhere on the scene, they found Kaler, probably covered in blood, with his hands in the air. He wasn't going to deny it. In fact, he outright confessed to having executed the family to take revenge for what happened to his daughters. Based on the evidence found, here's how the incident likely went down. Kaler pulled out his gun and shot Kenna and Kenneth on the steps of their home's rear entrance. Following this, he entered the home where he found Aiken, pressed the gun to his temple, and pulled the trigger. By this point, Devin had likely heard all the explosions coming from downstairs. He knew something was, potentially even that the father of the girls he'd preyed on was here to seek vengeance. Not knowing what to do, he hid behind the door of his bedroom, hoping that the gunman would leave if he couldn't find him. Of course, Kaler wasn't just going to leave. He found Devin cowering behind the door and forced him to his knees. Perhaps he even asked the victim to apologize for what he'd done. But Devin likely only begged for mercy. Unmoved by his tears, Kaler shot him in the head, just like he'd done with the rest of his family. Police found a number of empty shell casings at the scene, indicating that Kaler had emptied and then reloaded his magazine. If the evidence is to be believed, this was not just an act of passion, it was cold, calculated homicide. His wife Kaylee had still been in the garden when the argument erupted. She later reported watching Kenna and Kenneth get gunned down, after which she took her daughters up to their apartment, where she heard further gunshots. Eventually, she claims to have heard her husband talking on the phone and saying that he'd just taken 4 lives. Was Kaler calling the police to confess his crimes? It's likely that he was, since he didn't try to resist when he was taken into custody. The last thing he said to his wife before he was taken away was to tell his daughters that he'd only been trying to protect him. And with that, Kaler was taken into custody and charged with 4 counts of homicide in the first degree, plus 1 count of felony burglary. All of Shoshone County was buzzing after this incident. How could someone have done something so terrible? Was there any truth to the claims that Devin was a child predator? This made the court case a highly charged affair, forcing Kaler to wear a bulletproof vest as he appeared before the judge.
Faces life in prison with a mandatory minimum of 10 years for each murder count. Because he hasn't waived his right to a speedy trial, it has to start before February 19th.
Presentation of this.
Prior to this, Kaler had admitted to the police that he shot his neighbors dead because he snapped. He acknowledged that there had been a dispute going on, one that had forced him to take extreme measures to protect his family. Given all of this, everyone expected him to plead guilty in court. However, Kaler decided to shock everyone during his first court appearance. Despite his open admission of guilt in front of the police, Kaler pleaded not guilty to all of the charges. It's possible that his lawyer advised him to make this plea, since first-degree homicide is punishable by the death sentence in the state of Idaho. Even so, the evidence against him proved irrefutable. A nearby business owner had set up a surveillance camera in front of his store that captured footage of Kaler gunning his neighbors down. On top of this, he'd shared an image of Leon Gary Plausch, whose son had been abducted at Louisiana airport and sexually abused. Plausch had taken the life of the perpetrator, and Kaler had posted his picture with the caption, "How to Catch a Predator." This clearly showed that he was on the warpath and believed that slaying Devin was the only way forward. And then came the impact statements from Kenna's relatives, which basically sealed Kaler's fate. Her maternal grandfather, David Silva, said, "He killed an entire branch of our family tree. Never any great-grandchildren to watch grow up. I lost my best friend, Aiken Smith. He spent hundreds of hours volunteering throughout the community, an entire beautiful family taken by one person." Kenneth's brother, Joe, also had this to say, "What a man you are. Not only did you destroy my family, but yours as well," he reportedly said. "You said you were protecting your children. Let me ask you, who's protecting them now?" Joe's statement in particular highlights how Kaler deprived his children of having a father in their lives. In trying to protect them, he ended up destroying their loving home and leaving them with lifelong trauma. On March 25, 2024, Kaler pleaded guilty to reduced charges of homicide in the second degree. While this saved him from the death penalty, Judge Barbara Dugan sentenced him to life in prison, calling his crimes heinous and angrily reprimanding him for his homicidal spree. Kaler is now spending his days at a state correctional facility with no chance of parole. His family are trying to pick up the pieces with a GoFundMe started by Kaylee's brother-in-law, Buddy, but they have a long, hard road ahead. As for the Gardepis, their relatives have to settle for burying the dead and trying their best to move on as the Kellogg community set up a memorial for the deceased.
18-year-old in a neighboring apartment, the one below, was accused of lewd, inappropriate behavior in front of a window in full view of young kids outside. The kid's father, Major John Kaler, is now accused of shooting and killing that teenager and 3 other members of his family. The victims have been identified as Kenna Gordepi, her father Kenneth, and her 2 teenage sons, 18-year-old Devin Smith and 16-year-old Aiken Smith. A family friend says Kenna was a kind, hardworking single mom.
What do you think of this case? Did Major John Kaler go too far, or did he do what was necessary to protect his family?
Last time I spoke to Sarah Jane on the phone was unfortunately the last time that I spoke to any of my children.
Abusing your wife is already terrible, but taking advantage of your stepdaughter in a one-sided relationship is beyond evil. Over 2 decades ago, Lee Ford became known as one of the worst stepdads ever. After mistreating his stepfamily for years, he tragically ended the lives of his wife and her 4 children in the most gruesome way. The details of this case are truly heartbreaking, and we're diving into it because there's a real possibility that this man could be released in the coming years. A lot of people are understandably against it, and once you hear the full story, you'll see why. Stick around until the end, and you'll have a much clearer idea of why his release is such a huge concern for many. Let's kick things off with Leslie, the central figure in this story. On April 3, 1964, in the charming riverside town of Fordingbridge, Hampshire, England, Leslie Wyatt gave birth to a beautiful baby girl named Leslie Margaret Wyatt. Growing up in Telford, Shropshire, Leslie was surrounded by her loving brother and sister. She grew up to be a spirited and kind person, always ready to help others and greet everyone with a warm smile. At 18, she met Michael Tranter, a guy who seemed like he could be the love of her life. Michael was working one day when he spotted Leslie on the bus. Leslie was working at a nursing home in Wellington at the time, and the connection was instant. Michael thought Leslie was amazing and felt like he'd hit the jackpot. They got along so well that he couldn't wait to walk her home and get to know her better. Their relationship took off quickly. They moved in together, got married, and started a family right away. Michael was overjoyed about becoming a dad, saying it was a dream come true. Leslie, who loved kids, was equally excited. Their first child, Sarah Jane, was born on January 10, 1983. Shortly after, Leslie was pregnant again, leading to the arrival of Anne Marie about a year and a half later. Their family grew with the addition of Stephen and then Craig Jonathan. It seemed like they were a happy family, with Leslie and Michael clearly showing their love for each other through their growing family. But as often happens, things took a turn. The pressure of raising 4 kids so quickly started to weigh heavily on their marriage. Just a year after Craig was born, Michael moved out, and their marriage ended in divorce. Now, Leslie didn't spend much time dwelling on her divorce. She quickly moved on and married a new man named Lee Ford in early 1990. Lee was a laborer from Telford, and after they got married, Leslie and Lee had 2 children together. Unfortunately, the exact years of their births aren't widely documented. As for Leslie and Michael's friends and family, they were all skeptical about Lee Ford. He just gave off a vibe that made those who knew Leslie uneasy. On top of that, Leslie and Lee didn't seem like a perfect match. Leslie was slim and attractive, while Lee had a rough, scruffy look and came across as pretty tough. But what really raised red flags about their relationship was Lee's open dislike for Leslie's ex-partner, Michael. Lee made it clear from the get-go that he didn't want Michael around. He went out of his way to push Michael out of their lives, making excuses to keep him away whenever Michael tried to visit the kids. Lee's controlling nature and extreme jealousy were obvious right from the start, which are often signs of abusive behavior.
We know that extreme jealousy is a risk factor in domestic abuse perpetrators, and therefore they like to think that their wife has never had a previous partner. And in this case, he had 4 reminders, 4 children daily reminding them, and Michael was a good father.
But the warning signs didn't stop there. Just a few months into their marriage, Lee revealed his true colors. He started hitting Leslie and acting aggressively towards her. Leslie soon found herself reaching out for help, telling friends and family that Lee was abusing her. By 1995, Leslie had reached her breaking point. She packed up her children and moved to Cornwall, desperate to escape Lee and start a new life. Her move was a clear sign of her fear and determination to protect her family. However, Lee wasn't ready to let go. He tracked Leslie down by posing as a solicitor and contacting her family, showing just how far he was willing to go to keep control over her. Despite the alarming signs, Leslie decided to give Lee Ford another chance, hoping for a fresh start. They relocated to Carnkey, a small village in Cornwall, with Leslie's 6 children, including the 4 from her previous marriage. But Ford's promises of change turned out to be empty. His abusive behavior only got worse. He became even more controlling, dictating what Leslie could wear and trying to dominate every aspect of her life. Now, let's not rush to blame Leslie for not leaving Lee Ford sooner. Being stuck in an abusive relationship for a long time can seriously damage your self-esteem, making it incredibly hard to break free. A psychologist who looked into this case even said that Lee Ford's abusive behavior stemmed from Leslie's deep love for her children. As we've mentioned earlier, Ford had a big problem with Leslie's ex, Michael, and with Leslie's 4 kids, who constantly reminded him of Michael. Ford felt constantly sidelined because Leslie always put her children first. This frustration caused him to pull away from the family and spend more time drinking at the pub. His anger grew as he felt increasingly pushed aside. But Ford knew exactly what he was getting into. He married a divorced woman with kids, yet his immature and controlling behavior was totally out of line. Reports say that instead of joining in family activities, he would isolate himself in the garage to watch TV. The kids wanted to watch their own shows, and Ford's retreat to the garage wasn't just about wanting some alone time. It showed how disconnected and dissatisfied he was becoming. His growing isolation led him to unhealthy habits like drug use and heavy drinking, which only made his negative feelings worse. Meanwhile, Leslie's ex, Michael, was over 200 miles away in Telford and had been cut off from his children for 5 years at Ford's request. Michael was a loving father, and the situation of being kept away from his beloved kids left him feeling powerless and helpless. What's truly heartbreaking about this situation is how deeply it affected the children. They were right there, witnessing Lee Ford's abusive behavior towards their mother, and it took a heavy toll on their lives. Sarah Jane, for example, was a very quiet student with a troubling school record. Her poor attendance was a big red flag, hinting that something was seriously wrong at home. Anne Marie also showed signs of distress, which made it hard for others to connect with her. These behaviors were clear signals that the children were struggling. Leslie's brother, Peter, noticed this firsthand when he visited his sister. He saw how the kids acted differently when Ford was around. When Ford wasn't present, they were lively and engaging, just like kids should be. But as soon as he showed up, their demeanor changed dramatically. They became subdued and withdrawn, a clear sign that something was seriously amiss.
They had gone out of the room or out of the house, and they'd be totally different. They'd be bubbly and laughing, joking, running around, jumping up and down and things, really, like normal kids should do. So he was very controlling over the kids, I think, as well.
And Ford's overprotectiveness of Sarah Jane was particularly troubling. He would keep a close eye on her, even showing up at places she went to. This wasn't just about safety, it was a form of control. Ford was constantly monitoring her movements, which is a big red flag for abusive behavior. Things took a much darker turn when reports revealed that Ford had a sexual relationship with Sarah Jane. She was just 17 at the time, and Ford had been a part of her life since she was 6. This wasn't a one-time thing. It was the culmination of years of grooming and manipulation. Sarah Jane had been subjected to abuse for a long time, making this situation even more tragic. There are also reports that it wasn't just Sarah Jane, but also Anne Marie who were involved. This might explain why both of them were often quiet and kept to themselves. It's likely that the trauma they experienced played a big part in their behavior and isolation. Peter revealed in an interview that Leslie was aware of the disturbing situation for a while and chose to confide in him, asking for his advice. Despite Peter's serious concerns and warnings, Ford managed to convince Leslie that everything was just fine. Sadly, Leslie's decision to stay with Ford had devastating consequences, and the children were caught in the crossfire. Ford's behavior continued to spiral out of control. Feeling overwhelmed and desperate to change her situation, Leslie made the brave decision to leave him in August 2000. She sought legal help to get a restraining order against Ford and began the process of rebuilding her life for her kids. Meanwhile, Michael, who had been longing to reconnect with his children, took the opportunity to reach out to Sarah Jane. Unfortunately, when he called, she was busy, and that call turned out to be both the first and last time he would speak to any of his children in years.
The last time I spoke to Sarah Jane on the phone was unfortunately the last time that I spoke to any of my children.
The thought of Leslie leaving him and the potential public exposure of his abuse of Sarah Jane and Anne Marie terrified Lee Ford. This fear led to an explosive confrontation between him and Leslie. On August 30th, they had a heated argument about their separation, pushing Lee to the brink. In a moment of unimaginable horror, he decided to commit a crime that no one could have anticipated. After that day, Leslie and her 4 children vanished without a trace. Lee told friends and neighbors in the quiet Cornish village of Carnkey that Leslie had left him, taking the children with her. He canceled a job interview, claiming the family had come down with food poisoning. To cover his tracks, he sent his 2 biological children to stay with relatives and enrolled his youngest child in a new school. Meanwhile, he continued to live in their pebble-dashed bungalow. Lee even attempted to cash in Sarah Jane's last paycheck from McDonald's and made advances to a former girlfriend, all while insisting that Leslie had abandoned him. What's truly chilling is that after weeks of their supposed disappearance, Lee had the audacity to call Peter, Leslie's brother. He said, "Put your sister on. I know she's with you." Peter, confused and concerned, replied that Leslie wasn't with him and asked what was going on. Lee claimed they had a fight over money and that Leslie had left with the kids, but Peter wasn't convinced by Lee's story. Lee's refusal to let Leslie take the younger children and Peter's gut feeling made him suspect that something terrible had happened, even though he didn't want to believe it. Peter's growing fears led him to contact the police, initiating a missing persons investigation. The senior investigator on the case noted an unsettling feeling from the outset. Alarm bells started ringing as soon as Peter reported Leslie's disappearance. Michael, who was also married at the time, grew increasingly worried. He confided in his wife that he believed Lee Ford had killed the children. Although his wife thought he was being irrational, Michael's instinct turned out to be tragically accurate. After Peter reported Leslie and her children missing, the police quickly got involved. Lee Ford, panicked by the investigation, took drastic measures. He reburied the decaying bodies of Sarah Jane and Anne Marie, wrapping them in polythene. Wearing a face mask, he moved the bodies from the woodshed to a potato field about 4 miles away. Ford then took his own children to visit their grandparents in Shropshire, all while planning to move the remaining 3 bodies. On October 4th, police held a press conference announcing that Ford and his 2 children were also missing. Later that day, Ford was arrested while driving across Bodmin Moor. His children were found safe, and that night the police discovered the first of the bodies. Ford, who occasionally worked as a builder and roofer and was known for spending a lot of time drinking at the local cricket club, confessed to the murders. Over a harrowing 24-hour period, Ford murdered his wife, Leslie, and her 4 children, Sarah Jane, who was 17, Anne Marie, 16, Stephen, 14, and Craig, just 13. And it all started when Leslie finally found the guts to confront Ford again about his messed-up relationship with her daughters. She had been worried and upset for a while, and she decided it was time to face him head-on. This confrontation was intense and ugly, and it didn't end well. Ford responded with a horrifyingly brutal attack. What started as a heated argument turned into something much darker. On the fateful day of the murders, he grabbed a baseball bat and used it to beat her severely, right in their bedroom. The whole attack was brutal and unrelenting. After he had finished with that, he didn't stop there. Ford went to his garage, got a piece of rope, and came back to strangle Leslie. He was chillingly precise, using the rope in a way that left barely any visible marks on her. But Ford's killing spree didn't end with Leslie. Next, he turned his sights on Leslie's 4 kids, who he had been raising for more than 10 years. It was clear he had this all planned out. He systematically went through each child, killing them one by one. He approached them from behind using that same length of rope and made sure the murders were carried out in such a way that there were minimal signs of struggle or trauma. It was a horrifying display of premeditation and control. The pathologist later described his method as efficient, which just adds to the creepiness of it all. Ford had done his homework on this. He researched extensively on how to commit murder without getting caught, and it showed in the way he executed his plan. After the killings, he didn't just leave the bodies lying around. Instead, he moved them around to different locations to make sure they wouldn't be easily found. Ford took the bodies from a woodshed and moved them to a potato field, wrapping them in polythene to try and hide the evidence. He only spared his own 2 children with Leslie. His complete lack of remorse during his confession and throughout his court appearances was chilling. At first, Lee Ford tried to play it cool and pleaded not guilty to the murder charges. But on the morning of his trial, May 24, 2001, he decided to change his tune and admitted to killing his wife, Leslie. and her 4 kids. After he came clean, the court wasn't too lenient. A few days later, he was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each murder. Initially, Ford was facing a minimum of 35 years in prison before he could even think about parole. However, that got knocked down to 27 years, so now he's got to wait at least that long before he might have a chance at getting out. The impact on the community and the families of the victims was deep and lasting. Friends, neighbors, and relatives were left grappling with the enormity of the loss. Memorials and tributes sprang up in honor of the victims, and the local school created a book of condolence and a memorial garden. The funerals were deeply somber, with everyone reflecting on the lives that were cut short and the gaping hole left behind. Michael, Leslie's ex-partner, and Peter, Leslie's brother, have been trying to cope with the loss over the years. They find some comfort in the memories they have and the support from their community. Even with time, the pain of losing their loved ones is still very real. Now there's a new layer of worry as there's talk about Ford possibly being released at some point. Family and friends of the victims have started a petition to make sure Ford stays behind bars and never gets out. This petition mistakenly claims he could apply for parole in the next 3 years, but that's not right. The parole board confirmed that Ford isn't up for parole yet. He has to serve the full 27 years, which means he won't even be considered for parole until October 2027. When the time comes, the Secretary of State for Justice will refer his case to the parole board, who will then review whether it's safe to release him. Sometimes prisoners with life sentences can be looked at by the parole board up to 2 years before their minimum term is over. The board decides if they should be moved to an open prison as a step toward potential release. But for now, Ford's case remains firmly under review, and his early release isn't on the table. At the end of the day, Ford absolutely deserves to be locked up and face the harshest punishment for what he did. Leslie's kids had no business going through any of that. They were completely innocent. We can only hope and pray that he never gets out of there. So, if you're dealing with an abusive partner or someone toxic in your life, don't hesitate to reach out for help. It's crucial to put yourself first and take steps to protect yourself. Stay safe out there, and remember, you're not alone in this.
Australians all over the country are just shocked, saddened and devastated about what has happened in a suburban street up in suburban Queensland.
Hannah Clark seemed to have it all. A loving family, 3 beautiful children, and a passion for fitness. But behind closed doors, her life was a nightmare. In February 2020, her life and the lives of her young children were taken away by the man who was supposed to protect them.
You can't comprehend it.
No.
That's the unfortunate thing is I've always asked that question, why? That's always said, why? Who does that to their kids? Who,
That's right.
Take away their laughter, their games.
Their future.
Their future.
So, Rowan, we're not going to take you to the watch house.
He could have been arrested. Instead, police let Rowan Baxter go. The 42-year-old had just breached his domestic violence order and assaulted his estranged wife. But he wasn't initially charged over the attack, so was served a future court date.
We won't be objecting to bail or anything like that.
Less than 3 weeks later, he killed Ms. Clark and their 3 children.
Hannah Clark was born on September 8, 1988, in Brisbane, Australia, to Sue and Lloyd Clark. She had a younger brother, Nathaniel, who everyone called Nat. Hannah adored him, and from the start, she took on a motherly role, even though they were only a couple of years apart. Hannah was full of life. She was always buzzing with energy and loved being the center of attention. She played sports all through her school years and was even the school captain in college. As she moved through college, she developed a real passion for CrossFit, which led her to spend sometimes hours at the gym. It was there, in 2008, that she met Rowan Baxter. Rowan had just moved to Australia from New Zealand with his wife and young son. At the time, Hannah was only 20 years old, while Rowan was 31. After the two met during the boxing class, It didn't take long for Hannah to start falling for him. She decided to tell her parents about Rowan, but the situation was far from ideal. When Hannah told her parents about him, they weren't thrilled. Sue Clark, Hannah's mother, never trusted Baxter. She had a strong mother's instinct that told her something was off about him. She found him smug and cocky. Plus, the fact that he was 11 years older than her daughter, who had just barely left her teen years, made her even more uneasy. Rowan wasn't known for his smarts. He famously couldn't remember his 4-digit bank PIN and failed to register his car because no one told him he had to. He was obsessed with going to the gym and his physical appearance. He had large muscles that weren't entirely the result of hard work, as he used steroids to bulk up. Unlike Hannah, who built a successful career as a personal trainer with clients who loved her, Rowan struggled to keep clients. His short temper, which is a side effect of steroid use, often drove them away just as quickly as they signed up. As a result, Rowan cycled through a lot of gyms, as no gym wanted a personal trainer who made their clients uncomfortable or unhappy. And certainly, no gym would keep a trainer who insulted clients on social media, which is exactly what Rowan did. He especially targeted female clients, once commenting on how he had to change the soap in the men's room 3 times, but not once in the women's room. It was already mentioned that Hannah's parents didn't like Rowan at first, but they really tried to give him a chance. They wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt because Hannah loved him, and they didn't want to push her away. But eventually, they started to like him, and were happy for Hannah. Rowan promised her parents that he would leave his wife, who he was still living with even after they were separated. Hannah's parents weren't happy about that situation, but Rowan kept assuring them that it was just a matter of time and that he was staying for the sake of the kid. Finally, he did break off that relationship completely, and Hannah's parents felt relieved. For a brief moment, it seemed like he was following through on his promises. Rowan ended up proposing to Hannah, and they got married in October 2012 in Kingscliff, New South Wales, Australia. Hannah's parents said it was the best day of her life. Hannah herself told them she felt like a princess. At the time of their wedding, Hannah was 14 weeks pregnant with their first child, Aaliyah, who was born on April 10, 2013. 2 years later, on March 19, 2015, Liana was born, and a year after that, on December 4, 2016, Trey came into the world. Aaliyah was described as a smart, brilliant, and sassy young girl who was destined to achieve a lot when she grew up. Liana was funny, cheeky, sweet, and full of empathy for others. And Trey, the youngest, was the apple of his mother's eye. He was the golden child, often described as a mommy's boy. Even at the age of 3, he had already started showing a sporting side, having learned how to kick and pass a football. Rowan, likely due to his difficult personality and lack of social skills, was never able to make enough money to support his family, and this left Hannah as the main breadwinner. The couple decided to open a gym together, but they didn't have enough money to get their venture off the ground. Hannah's parents stepped in as financial backers as they wanted to support their daughter's dreams. At the time, in addition to personal training, both Hannah and Rowan worked at a sports shoe retailer. Rowan had pushed for this arrangement, likely because he wanted to keep tabs on Hannah and wanted to know where she was at all times. His behavior at the store was no different from how he acted at the various gyms he had worked at before. He belittled the female employees just as he had done with his clients, and never missed a chance to assert his supposed superiority over women. One day, Rowan was giving a personal training session to Hannah's mom, Sue. During the session, he intentionally dropped her on her head, which caused her to violently collide with the floor and start bleeding. Rowan stood there laughing at her and mocking her lack of coordination. Despite this incident and their own reservations, Hannah's parents continued to try their hardest to accept Rowan for the sake of their daughter. In the early days of the relationship, it seemed good. Both Hannah and Rowan appeared happy. But after the children arrived, things began to change, and they changed quickly. Even though the gym wasn't entirely their own, Rowan's behavior became increasingly erratic and concerning. Sue noticed early on that Rowan didn't like her, and he treated her badly from the start. But Sue wasn't one to back down, and she stood up to Rowan, which became a huge issue for him. It was clear that his problem wasn't just with her personally. He had a deep-seated belief that men were superior to women. That complex colored everything he did. Sue's husband, Lloyd, also felt Rowan's hostility. Rowan would belittle him too, and seemed especially jealous of the close relationship between Hannah and her mom. Rowan didn't want Hannah to have any meaningful relationships with anyone, especially those who might point out how wrong his behavior was. He wanted her completely isolated. As time went on, Hannah's family noticed troubling changes in her. She became increasingly withdrawn and overly concerned about her appearance. She was constantly worried that she looked fat, a fear Rowan had drilled into her by calling her a pig and saying she was overweight, especially after she had their children. Rowan seemed to take pleasure in pushing people to their limits. At the gym, he would push his clients so hard during workouts that they would often become physically ill. Rowan's expectations for Hannah were impossibly high. She had to be attractive enough to meet his standards, yet somehow control the attention she might get from other men. He didn't want her looking like a slob, but he also couldn't stand the idea of anyone else finding her attractive. At that point, things were financially tough for the couple. They opened their gym in 2015, but after 3 years, they had to move it to a different location due to struggles. Sue and Lloyd did everything they could to help, even going as far as remortgaging their home to cover bills and rent. Despite their support, Rowan's reckless spending drained their resources and put even more strain on the family. Hannah ended up opening a secret bank account just to manage their bills because Rowan was squandering the money on his own interests, leaving the family finances in disarray. Despite being the primary breadwinner, Hannah was left trying to keep everything afloat while Rowan spent their resources. According to Sue, Hannah was considering leaving Rowan shortly after Liana was born. But then she became pregnant with Trey, and Rowan's reaction to having a son made Hannah feel even more trapped. She was sure that Rowan would be determined to keep Trey. But despite her own doubts, Sue and Lloyd began preparing their home for Hannah and the children. Hannah's passion for CrossFit was one of the few bright spots in her life. She competed with a team from the gym, including a close friend, Dave Kramer. In 2019, Hannah's team qualified for a major competition, and she was thrilled. Rowan, however, didn't qualify for the solo event and insisted on joining Hannah's team, even though no one wanted him there. His insistence was typical of his controlling nature. Hannah, in a moment of frustration, apologized to a team member for Rowan's behavior, but her young daughter, Aaliyah, accidentally recorded the conversation on her phone. When Rowan found out, he got extremely upset and accused Hannah of disrespecting him. After this outburst, Rowan pulled out of the competition as he believed that without him, the team would have to pull out. But despite the setback, the team managed to find a replacement. When Hannah returned home from the gym on the day of the competition, Rowan and the kids were missing, with no message or note left behind. Rowan finally called her at lunchtime, blaming her for the situation and saying he would return the children when he felt like it. He also expressed his disbelief that she had contacted her mom and brother, revealing that he had been listening to her calls. Sue encouraged Hannah to continue with the competition and insisted that pulling out would only play into Rowan's hands. Despite the chaos and fear, Hannah was determined to not let Rowan's manipulation control her life any further. She confided in a few trusted people and told them that she was scared Rowan might use the children as leverage against her if she dared to stand up to him or file for divorce. Though she believed Rowan wouldn't physically harm the children, she was terrified he might run away with them or turn them against her. Hannah was confident Rowan would never physically harm the kids because, up until that point, he hadn't physically attacked her. Her abuse had been emotional, financial, and sexual, but not physical. This distinction led her to not fully recognize her situation as domestic abuse. But things took a dark turn later that year. After a jiu-jitsu class, Rowan came home full of adrenaline. Without warning, he tripped Hannah to the floor, leaned over her, and grabbed her forcefully by the throat. He threatened her, saying, "You have no idea what I'm capable of." This incident was a stark escalation from his previous behavior, and it seemed to be the tipping point for Hannah. Despite the emotional and financial abuse she had been through, Hannah remained a strong, independent woman at her core. At that point, she decided to seek help from a police officer. During their conversation, Hannah detailed her life with Rowan and the abuse she had suffered. The officer explained that being coerced into sexual intercourse daily against her will was indeed a form of sexual assault. This realization was a crucial turning point for Hannah, as it validated her experiences and helped her recognize the severity of her situation. The officer explained the concept of coercive behavior to Hannah, helping her understand that she was experiencing a form of domestic abuse as defined by law. Realizing she was indeed a victim of domestic abuse, Hannah quickly packed the bare necessities for herself and her children and moved into her parents' house in Camp Hill. In November of 2019, with the relationship officially over, though not yet legally dissolved, Hannah decided to allow Rowan to see the children. At that time, without any formal court orders, there was little she could do to control the situation. Around the same period, Rowan began visiting his church pastor. The pastor later observed that Rowan had an alpha male complex and controlling tendencies. Rowan confided in the pastor on several occasions and revealed moments when he recognized that he was in the wrong and needed to change, yet he struggled to figure out how to make those changes. The pastor also observed Rowan's behavior at the gym and was taken aback by the aggressive and controlling tendencies he witnessed. Rowan's clients regularly vomited during his training sessions, which was a clear sign of excessive and harmful practices. In private conversations with Hannah, the pastor tried to offer help, but Hannah was clear about her position. She told co-workers that she feared Rowan might one day try to kill her, indicating that she had no intention of getting back together. Despite this, she had not yet filed a formal complaint or sought further protection. On Boxing Day, Rowan's confidence in his control over Hannah reached a disturbing new level. While Hannah was walking down the street with her children, Rowan approached them and forcibly took their daughter, Liana. Hannah was frantic, and for 2 days she had no idea where her daughter was. Eventually, the police found Liana with her father, who had not harmed her but had caused significant distress to Hannah. Following this incident, the police advised Hannah to file a formal complaint and get a restraining order against Rowan. Although she took this advice, Rowan was still granted joint custody of the children, which allowed him to continue his harassment. The day after taking his children out, Rowan returned them to Hannah's parents' home as agreed, but in a particularly cruel act of intimidation, he put pictures of Hannah in her underwear around the outside of his car for the children to see. When Hannah tried to remove the photos, Rowan reacted violently. He grabbed her by the lower arm, causing a sprain to her wrist, and then hit her in the face, busting her lip. This physical assault was witnessed by Hannah's mother, Sue, who rushed to her daughter. Rowan fled the scene, but the damage was already done. On the morning of February 19, 2020, Hannah was preparing to drop her 3 children off at school. Rowan Baxter, ignoring the restraining orders, forced his way into the passenger seat of her Kia Sportage. Despite Hannah's desperate pleas for him to leave, Rowan didn't. As they drove, Hannah noticed a man washing his car and decided to stop there. This man, Michael Zemek, was about to witness a scene of unimaginable horror. Right there, Rowan began pouring gasoline over Hannah and the children. At first, Michael was startled by how fast the car pulled up and the desperate cries for help. He heard Hannah scream for help and witnessed Rowan's cold, detached demeanor. The situation escalated quickly when Rowan ignited the gasoline with a lighter, which led the front of the car to burn. Hannah managed to escape the car, but her body was still burning. She screamed for her children, who were still trapped inside. Her cries were heard by an off-duty paramedic who happened to be passing by. This paramedic rushed to Hannah while Michael Zemek, despite suffering burns to his hands and face, used his garden hose to try to extinguish the flames surrounding Hannah's body. Despite their efforts, Hannah's focus remained on her children, whom she feared had been lost in the fire. When Michael Zemek realized that there were children in the car, he tried to reach the vehicle, but the intense heat and flames made it impossible to approach. Hannah suffered burns over 97% of her body, with only the soles of her feet untouched by the flames. The severity of her injuries was almost beyond comprehension, yet her thoughts remained solely with her children. When the police came, Hannah was unrecognizable. But despite her critical condition, she made sure that the details of the attack and the identity of her assailant were clearly communicated. She identified Rowan Baxter as the perpetrator and confirmed that there was a protection order against him, and provided a detailed description of him and the incident. When the officer asked if Rowan had ever been threatening before, Hannah replied, "Not to me, no." It's a tragic sign of how deep the abuse had run, that even as her life was slipping away, she didn't see it as abuse. Meanwhile, Rowan Baxter, who had suffered severe burns over 80% of his body, was a different story. After managing to escape the burning car, he sat on the roadside while others worked to put out the flames. Instead of showing any concern for his children or making any effort to help, Baxter found a knife he had brought with him and began to guard the car, preventing anyone from reaching the children inside. He even threatened a neighbor who tried to help with a fire extinguisher. He then took his own life by stabbing himself in the chest. Hannah Clark died in the hospital later that day at the age of 31. Her children, Aaliyah, Liana, and Trey, were aged 6, 4, and 3. After the incident, an inquest was held to figure out what went wrong and how to prevent similar tragedies. People who knew Rowan and Hannah shared their experiences. Nicole, Hannah's friend who had tried to warn the police, expressed her frustration that they didn't act sooner. Hannah's mom, Sue, spoke about how Rowan had mistreated her daughter and even assaulted her. The pastor who had tried to help Rowan also testified, mentioning how he believed Rowan felt no remorse for his controlling behavior. The note found written by Rowan Baxter on January 26, 2020, provides a glimpse into his mindset before the tragedy unfolded. In it, he painted himself as the victim, blaming Hannah for destroying his life and threatening to make her suffer by taking their children away from her. The note's tone and content reveal his distorted perception of victimhood and his intent to cause Hannah emotional pain, suggesting that he may have planned to abduct the children as a form of punishment. Just a few weeks before the horrific events of February 19th, Hannah confided in her friend Nicole about her deep fears for her safety. Nicole, alarmed by Hannah's distress and aware of Rowan's increasingly strange behavior, decided to go to the police to express her concerns. Nicole told the police that she believed Hannah and her children were in imminent danger. Despite Nicole's warnings and her detailed accounts of Rowan's threatening behavior, the police couldn't do anything, as they didn't have solid evidence of a physical threat or an actual crime. On March 9, 2020, Hannah and her children were laid to rest together.
We've got each other, so that's our strength.
And we've got our boys.
Mm.
You know, we've lost half our family, but we still have the other half, and we've got to be strong for them and for each other.
In response to the devastating loss of Hannah Clark and her children, Clark's family founded the Small Steps for Hannah Foundation in March 2020. This charity aims to fight domestic and family violence in Australia to prevent incidents like the one that claimed Hannah and her children. On February 23, 2020, over 1,000 people gathered at the Bill Hewitt Reserve in Camp Hill for a public vigil to honor and mourn the family. To commemorate their memory, a section of the reserve was dedicated as Hannah's place with a sign, a shelter, and newly planted trees. This memorial was officially opened on September 8, 2020, on the day that would have been Hannah's 22nd birthday. Could more awareness have saved Hannah and her children? Or were the warning signs overlooked? Comment down below. In the scenic valleys of Vermont, there's a tiny town called Pawlet that was rocked with a gruesome triple homicide in September of 2024. It was one of the many cases in America where an entire family was mercilessly slain. And what's even more chilling is that authorities have no clue who might have done it. The mystery deepens even further when you consider that the head of the household, Brian Crossman, had just been elected to a local office. Did this have something to do with his tragic death? And if so, why were his wife and stepson slain alongside him? These are just some of the questions we'll try to answer today as we unpack the puzzling demise of an entire family and the multiple mysterious individuals that might have been involved. The victims of this senseless violence were 46-year-old Brian Crossman Sr., his wife, 41-year-old Erica Crossman, and Erica's son, 13-year-old Colin Taft. Though Brian wasn't Colin's biological father, he'd taken on the role of stepfather and provided a loving home for his wife's child. However, there are still many unanswered questions about the Crossman household. The fact that Brian referred to himself as Senior suggests that there's a Brian Crossman Jr. out there somewhere. And since Brian Sr. himself was just 43, it's unlikely that Brian Jr. was much older than Colin. He was probably a teenager or at most in his early 20s, unless Brian had had him at a very young age. And then there's the matter of Erica's maiden name. According to reports, Erica Crossman used to be Erica Pelusiak before she married Brian. If that's the case, Colin's surname, Taft, likely comes from his biological father. One has to wonder, where was this mysterious Mr. Taft, and under what circumstances did Erica leave him? Given that she brought Colin along to this new home, there's a chance that her relationship with her former partner didn't end on good terms. It should be mentioned that Brian and Erica had gotten married just a few months before this incident in June of 2024. It's unknown if Erica was a resident of Pollitt prior to marrying Eric, but considering it's a town of just 1,400 people, it's more likely that she moved in from out of town. One thing we can say for certain is that Brian hadn't lived in that home for a long time before the wedding. It's now time to start talking about another wrinkle in this case, the historic farmhouse Brian and his new family had moved into. Based on information released to the press, Brian was born to enormous generational wealth. The farmhouse on Vermont Route 133 that became the scene of the crime had been in the Crossman family for generations, but it appears to have fallen into disrepair at some point. This theory is based on Brian specifically setting up shop there to start fresh, but the farmhouse wasn't empty when he decided to move in. Brian's sister, whose name hasn't been released to the public, had apparently been living there, but reports seem to suggest that she hadn't been taking good care of it. You see, Brian didn't just start living at the farm. Neighbors stated that he'd been cleaning it up and trying to bring it back to working order. He wanted to grow things and potentially run the farm like a proper business, indicating that his sister had neglected the farm and the house over the years. By the time Brian and Erica got together, though, the farmhouse had been given a fresh coat of bright white paint. It was clean and put together enough to host their wedding, providing a beautiful backdrop to the happiest day of their lives. But those white walls were soon going to be painted red with the family's blood. Before we get into that, we must first understand how bizarre Brian's decision to start working the farm truly was. Brian had spent his entire life in Pollitt, and everyone in the town loved him since he was a boy. He attended Wells Village School in the local community, where Principal Jean Marie Oakman admired him for his kind, generous personality. He was part of a big family, with 5 brothers and a sister along with countless cousins and other relatives. By all accounts, Brian was fiercely protective of all of them. Principal Oakman has said that he was especially kind to his sister, suggesting that she needed some extra support from her big brother. Indeed, Brian spent much of his life being extremely loyal to his kin. But it seems like he strayed from the flock at some point. Instead of operating the family farm, he became a lineman for a utility company called Green Mountain Power, which provided electricity to 250,000 Vermont residents. This made Brian an important man, and the community honored him for it. And yet, there might have been something sinister going on behind the scenes. After all, we've already established that Brian likely had a biological son that was nowhere in the picture. Where had this son gone? If he was still in Pollitt, how did he manage to avoid giving a statement about his father's demise? That too in a tiny community of just over 1,000 people. As for Erica, her background is practically shrouded in mystery compared to Brian's. No information has been released on when she came to Pollitt, but we can assume that she entered Brian's life during a time of great change. 2024 was by no means a normal year for Brian. For starters, he met a woman that basically swept him off his feet. a woman he loved so much that he decided to help her raise her boy with no questions asked. But that's just one of the many changes he went through over the year. After devoting his life to the Paulet community, Brian was a shoo-in for political office. The tiny town didn't have many opportunities in that space, but Brian managed to secure a seat in one of the most exclusive political entities around, the Select Board. This political body is unique to New England's style of governance. Members of the Select Board exercise broad executive powers that basically make them managers of the local area. Early in 2024, Brian was elected to a seat on the board, which made him one of the most powerful men around. Not only did he work for a utilities company that supplied electricity to a third of Vermont, but he was also on the council that made big decisions about his own town. Brian was moving up the ranks faster than anyone could have imagined, and it seemed like he had nowhere to go but up. If Brian had continued down this path, there's a chance that he'd have become chairperson of the board. Such a rapid rise didn't just bring him personal success, though. It also might have put a target on his back, and not just for the violence that ended his life. But more on that later. For now, let's discuss the final change that occurred in 2024, which had to do with the Crossman farmhouse. We don't know where Brian lived before moving in there, but it's clear that he wanted to make it a home for his new family. According to the neighbors, it seemed like he wanted a fresh start. From what exactly? That's a question that neither authorities nor relatives of the deceased have been able to answer. It might have had something to do with the whirlwind romance between him and Erica, which seemed to culminate in an ad hoc wedding at the recently renovated farmhouse. Or perhaps it had to do with Brian's political appointment. There are many theories we can provide, but first, we must take a look at how the violent events of September the 15th unfolded. With the stage now set, it's time to move on to the incident that extinguished 3 bright lives. It all began at 3:45 a.m. on a chilly Sunday morning. This was possibly the quietest time of the week for local police. Paulet doesn't have much of a nightlife, and the community's strong Catholic roots meant that most residents woke up early for Sunday service. As a result, hardly anyone tended to be out at this time, which meant that police weren't expecting anything close to what happened. At 3:45, police received a call reporting a suspicious individual near the Crossman property. This was the first of many calls that police would receive before they finally headed over to Route 133. Once they arrived, they found a grisly scene. Brian, Erica, and Colin were long dead. Their bodies were riddled with bullets, indicating that a gunman had emptied an entire clip into the family before running off. However, these bullets hadn't been distributed equally across each victim. Brian had been shot multiple times in the torso before a final execution-style shot to the head. Erica, on the other hand, only received 1 shot to the head. As for Colin, police reports were more tight-lipped about the details due to him being a minor, but they did admit that he had multiple gunshot wounds as well. Multiple shots for Brian and Eric, but just a single headshot for Erica. Why hadn't the gunman treated all 3 victims with equal rage? Why was his violence directed mostly at the men in the household? Based on police reports, it appears that Brian was the main target, since his body contained the largest number of bullets. But we can't ignore the brutality of Colin's death either. Shooting a child of just 13 point blank requires either a burning lust for violence or a chilling disregard for human life. And what about the suspicious individual seen near the scene of the crime? That might just be the most interesting and puzzling aspect of this story. And in order to get to it, we must first discuss the seemingly unknowable motive behind the triple homicide. Was it mere coincidence that Erica married Brian not long after he became one of the most prominent men in the area? Could his rise to power have played a role in her romantic pursuit? Whatever the case may be, Brian's newfound authority made him a target in some more obvious ways as well. People tend to be envious of success, and with so little known about Erica's former partner and Colin's biological father, it's possible that this was a case of a jilted lover crossing the thin red line. That seems like a valid theory, but it's not the only one that's been floating around. Brian's rapid takeover of the family farm could have rubbed some of his brothers the wrong way. It's clear from the school principal's statements that Brian and his sister had a special relationship. Does that mean that he didn't get along quite as well with his brothers? Tensions between siblings are only natural, and they can get extremely heightened when there's money or property involved. Even though the Crossman farm was located in a relatively secluded part of the country, its market value would still be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. If his brothers felt like he cheated them out of their inheritance, this would be enough of a motive to take him out. This theory still doesn't explain the calculated, execution-style slaying of Erica, which is why some might say that the jilted ex-lover angle holds more weight. And then, of course, there are plenty of people that might have resented Brian for his success. With a job at a highly relevant local company, an extremely valuable farm to his name, plus a seat on the select board, Brian could have been the subject of anyone's envy. But there is a reason to suspect that a family member was involved, at least in some way, shape, or form. This reason has to do with the suspicious individual that neighbors reported to the police in the early hours of Sunday morning. As soon as police found the bodies, they knew that they'd died under mysterious circumstances. People don't get shot to death every day, least of all in sleepy little Pollitt, so authorities immediately set up an ad hoc headquarters at the local fire station. The deaths hadn't been confirmed as homicides yet. That would require an autopsy report, but police still had an investigation to conduct. When witnesses reported the suspicious individual to the police, they included a detail that's relevant to the entire case. What was this detail? The person was apparently completely covered in blood. This made locating them a top priority for the police, but surprisingly enough, it didn't take them long to track the individual down. They initiated a search of the surrounding area, which happened to include the Wells Village school that Brian had attended as a child. And who did they happen to find there? The same blood-covered individual reported in the 911 calls. Police immediately took him into custody, but revealed only two details. The first detail was that the individual claimed not to be involved in the homicide. This seems like an obvious enough statement. No one would admit to slaying a family of 3, but this person had their blood on his clothing. Forensic testing confirmed that the blood belonged to at least one of the victims. So despite his claims, this man was clearly a suspect that was at the Crossman residence during, or at least after, the incident had occurred. Now, according to the suspect, whose name still hasn't been released to the public, he supposedly stumbled across the residence after the Crossmans were already dead. He had their blood all over his clothing because he'd handled the bodies in some way. Why would he do such a thing? The answer to that lies in the second and final detail the police revealed. You see, this wasn't just any random person. According to reports, the suspect found at Wells Village School covered in the blood of the victims was actually a relative of the family. There's no word on whether he was related to Brian, Erica, or Colin, but the very fact that he's a relative at all raises more questions than it answers. And to make matters even more confusing, police released the suspect without charge and refused to explain the decision. With this case, it seems like every new revelation adds another layer to the never-ending mystery. Let's get into some of the questions we must now ask.
Feel sad for this.
Vermont State Police are continuing to investigate after 3 people were shot to death in their Pollitt home. State Police say no arrests have been made in connection to the homicides. The victims have been identified as Select Board member 46-year-old Brian Crossman, his 41-year-old wife Erica, and her 13-year-old son, Brian's stepson, Colin Taft. Investigators say this was not a random act, but it's still an active crime scene and investigation.
If we start with the obvious, what was a relative of the victims doing near the crime scene at that time? If we're to believe that he got their blood on him because he cradled their corpses, why did he run away instead of staying at the scene of the crime? And moreover, why did he run to the local school of all places? Hiding out at Brian's childhood school seems like an odd choice if this person was hiding at all. Based on what the police have said, it seems more like he gave himself up willingly as soon as they arrived on the scene. Did this person go to the school because it was a source of comfort for him? Perhaps because he went there as a child as well? The unknown individual remains a person of interest. But you might be wondering why the police didn't make any charges. Isn't the presence of the blood of the victims on his clothing enough of a probable cause for an arrest? The police are clearly doing their best here, but they also failed to respond to the first 911 call that informed them about a mysterious presence near the Crossman farm. If they'd just taken that call seriously, Brian and his family might still be alive today. This raises the question, did the police ignore the call on purpose? Brian was a well-connected man, a powerful man, and men like that tend to make enemies, especially in opposing government departments like the police. We're not saying there's corruption at play here, but these are questions we have to ask. The current position of the police is that this was a one-off incident that doesn't have any complex motive behind it, but Brian's status in the town makes that very unlikely. Relatives of the family have spoken about what an amazing person Brian was. They've talked about how hard he worked and how much he cared for the community. And yet a few people are missing from these conversations. There's Brian Crossman Jr., for one, whose very existence hasn't been confirmed yet. If he doesn't exist, why would Brian add Sr. after his name in the first place? And then there's Erica's ex, who still hasn't resurfaced, despite his son and former lover dying a tragic demise. Will there be answers to any of these questions? We'll just have to wait and see. For now, the friends and family of the victims will have to bear the incredible trauma of this tragedy and hope that the police are able to make sense of what happened. Considering that nearly half of all homicides in the U.S. go unsolved, there's no guarantee that they'll be successful. On September 22nd, 1 week after the triple homicide, Brian Crossman Jr. admitted himself into a psychiatric facility, reporting serious mental distress. He had a history of mental issues, along with a learning disability that created a lot of tension between him and his father. Crossman lived in Granville, New York, not too far from Powlett. His grandmother had apparently told police that Crossman knew how to use firearms, and that he was capable of committing such a violent act. It turns out that he was also the suspicious, blood-soaked individual that police found. They were forced to release him due to lack of evidence, but upon gathering witness testimony, they were finally able to issue a warrant for his arrest. Police in Granville immediately brought him into custody under charges of fleeing from justice. Further reports revealed that he got blood on his clothing after trying to drag his father's corpse outside the home. Crossman had been visiting the family for the weekend, and he claimed that he went out for a walk and found their dead bodies when he returned. We now know this narrative to be false. It's currently unknown whether Crossman will be extradited to Vermont, but he's being held in custody without bail, and chances are that he'll be made to cross state lines to face justice for his crimes. What do you think of this case? Will the Crossman family ever find justice? Or will this be just another case that never gets solved?
Before Robert Fisher wound up one of the FBI's 10 most wanted. Happy birthday, dear Brittany. He was a dad to Brittany and Bobby.
Don't say anything.
A husband to Mary.
Mary was sweet. She was, he would probably say she was a little difficult.
In April 2001, in Scottsdale, Arizona, the Fisher family's home exploded in a devastating fire. Inside, the bodies of Mary and her 2 kids were found, murdered before the fire even started. The prime suspect, Robert William Fisher, vanished without a trace. This is the story of the Fisher family murders. Robert William Fisher was born on April 13, 1961, in Brooklyn, New York City, as the middle child of William and Jan Fisher. In 1976, his parents divorced, which left Robert and his 2 sisters to move with their father to Arizona. They all went to Saguaro High School in Tucson, but the family's split had a lasting impact on Robert. Friends from his high school days remember him as being quite bitter about the divorce. In fact, he later talked frequently about it with his co-workers and revealed how much he felt his mother's departure had changed his life. Fisher joined the United States Navy and tried to become a SEAL, but he didn't make the cut. He loved the outdoors, and he particularly enjoyed hunting and fishing. After a stint as a firefighter in California, which ended due to a back injury, he moved his family to Arizona. There, he started working in the medical field and took on roles as a surgical catheter technician and respiratory therapist. In the late 1980s, he also worked briefly as a weed sprayer. One of his former employers described him as a quiet man who struggled with back pain but was reliable on the job. In 1987, Robert Fisher met and married Mary Cooper, and they seemed to have a solid relationship. They moved to Scottsdale, Arizona, where they built a life together with their 2 children and a black lab, living in the 2200 block of 74th Place. From the outside, they appeared to be a normal, church-going family as they were actively involved in their Baptist church. But as time went on, cracks began to show in their marriage.
He had had a difficulty with his parents and the divorce that they'd gone through, and so he had told me he'd never go through that again.
In one particularly harsh incident, Fisher turned a garden hose on Mary after he felt she had spoken out of turn. He was also embarrassed that his son Bobby didn't share his passion for hunting and fishing. One time, he tried to teach Bobby and his daughter Brittany how to swim by throwing them off a boat. According to his hunting partner, Sandy Gillespie, the children were crying and Brittany was screaming. Fisher pulled them back into the boat and said, "Now there, how's that?" Fisher's controlling nature extended to the home, where he wouldn't allow the walls to be painted any color other than white, and only a few pictures were permitted on the walls. Mary's friend Kimberly Sue Davidson told police that Mary's mother had made special items like quilts several times, but Mary wasn't allowed to hang them up. Instead, she had to store them in the closet, with Robert constantly nagging her to get rid of them. Despite this, Fisher tried to maintain the image of a devoted family man. Mary took a job, which she described to friends as a security fund, while Robert worked at the Mayo Clinic's Scottsdale campus as a respiratory therapist and catheter technician. Though he was considered a good worker, his colleagues noticed that he often talked about his marital problems. He often mentioned how his parents' divorce had affected him, once saying that his life would have been much better if his mother Jan hadn't left his father. These issues even came up during his hunting and fishing trips, where he would discuss his struggles with his friends. In time, Fisher displayed even more disturbing behavior. There was a time where they had gotten an elk and were preparing it, and he randomly decided to smear the blood on his face as well as do other strange things. On another occasion, during a camping trip, he sneaked up behind some unsuspecting campers he didn't even know and fired his gun into the air multiple times just to scare them. Witnesses reported that he was smiling and laughing as he did this. More issues began to surface in his marriage, which caught the attention of their circle of friends. It was said that he showed more affection to his black Labrador retriever than to his family. In some home videos, his interactions with his family come across as very cold and odd. Robert William Fisher's first run-in with the law occurred in 1997 when he had a dispute over a stray football that apparently belonged to a neighbor. He claimed the dog kept coming onto his property and trying to attack the dog, and eventually he shot the pit bull when it came onto his property. Of course, the police were called, and they believed that Robert had tried to get the dog onto his property on purpose as he hated it. Robert claimed otherwise, and we'll probably never know the full truth. Meanwhile, the clash between Robert and Mary got out of control. They even sought counseling from their pastor at church, but nothing seemed to help.
Mary was very involved. She served with the children's ministry. Her children were friends with my children.
Robert was extremely controlling. At that point, he wouldn't allow anything to be put up on the walls unless it was something he wanted. For example, Mary once received a tapestry from a relative, but Robert wouldn't let her hang it up. He constantly nagged her about various things. Ironically, neighbors living nearby at the time mentioned that during their frequent yelling matches, they could always hear Mary screaming, but they never actually heard Robert yelling. This might have been because Robert was trying to pretend like a gentle, loving family man, even though he wasn't. He had confided in his coworkers that the marriage was falling apart, but he also said, divorce is not an option. Mary, on the other hand, had told friends that she was planning to divorce Robert in the coming weeks. On the night of April 9th, 2001, neighbors reported hearing another massive fight coming from the Fisher household at around 10:30 in the evening. And in a sudden moment, everything caught fire.
There are people in there and this whole house exploding.
The shockwave shook homes, and within moments, 911 calls started flooding in from nearly every neighborhood nearby. The explosion was so powerful that it blew out the brick wall of the Fisher house. It was an intense, fully involved fire with flames towering over 20 feet high.
Big fire. Can you see it? Big fire. You bet I can see it. Some house just exploded and ignited on fire.
The firefighters focused on keeping the fire from spreading to the closely packed neighboring houses. As they tried to put out the fire, they had no idea what they were dealing with or whether anyone was trapped inside. Once they finally got the fire under control and extinguished, they started to investigate. It was then that they noticed one of the Fisher family vehicles, Mary's 4Runner, was missing. There was a brief hope that the family had left before the explosion, unaware of the tragedy. But that hope quickly faded. The explosion had been so powerful that it even damaged Robert's truck, which had been parked right in front of the house. As investigators began sifting through the rubble, they brought in the forensics team to piece what had actually happened. Unfortunately, it didn't take long for them to make a discovery: the remains of 3 bodies. At first, it was assumed that they had died in the fire, but a closer examination revealed something far more disturbing. The forensics team uncovered evidence that pointed to foul play. They found a hose leading into the furnace that had been pulled out on purpose, and nearby, a candle had been set on the floor next to accelerants like gasoline. It became clear that this was a staged scene. Someone had planned this to either cover up evidence or buy themselves more time. At this point, the investigators were uncertain about many details, but what they learned from the medical examiner was even more horrifying. The bodies discovered were those of Robert Fisher's family, his wife Mary Cooper, and his 2 children, Brittany Fisher, as well as Robert Bobby William Fisher Jr. The examination revealed that they had been murdered before the fire started. One item that survived the fire was Robert Fisher's gun safe, which had several weapons in it. However, his handgun was missing. Along with the weapons, the safe also held some movies and some other personal items. On the evening of the murders, Fisher was captured on the surveillance tape at an ATM machine around 10:40 p.m. He withdrew the daily maximum of $280. In the footage, he was seen wearing an Oakland Raiders cap, and you can see Mary's white 4Runner in the background. Most authorities and investigators involved in the case believe this transaction took place after the crime. At first, it took a few days before Fisher was officially listed as a suspect or even a person of interest. But as the pieces began to come together, they realized that he most likely had some kind of involvement or was the guilty party. Nothing seemed to add up if he were innocent. Why didn't he come home? If he had just been out blowing off steam and something like this happened to his family by chance, it would be an unimaginable coincidence. There was also the fact that all of his clothes had been removed from the house. Why would he take all of his clothes and withdraw that money unless he was planning to flee? Eventually, Robert William Fisher was charged with 3 counts of felony murder, 1 count of felony arson, and unlawful flight to avoid prosecution. Pictures and posters of him were distributed widely. Fisher was a white male, roughly 6 feet tall. At the time of his disappearance, he weighed about 180 pounds, though his current weight is unknown if he is still alive. He has a surgical scar on his lower back and a gold upper bicuspid tooth, which she could have had removed. After finding Mary Fisher's car in Tonto National Forest, the police faced challenging weather conditions as foul weather and snow moved into the area. This forced the suspension of the search, which only covered about a mile around the vehicle's location. Footsteps were found leading toward the Fort Apache Indian Reservation, but that area was never thoroughly searched. This has led many, including those who have followed or investigated the case, to speculate that Robert Fisher may have reached the reservation and either got help or found a ride which led him to escape. The failure to locate Fisher in the immediate area around the vehicle was a huge disappointment to the police. They followed a set of footprints leading onto the reservation, but found no sign of Fisher. A couple reported seeing a man resembling Fisher walking along the nearby Young Road several days before the car was found, but they didn't report the sighting until after the vehicle was discovered. Lori Greenbeck, an acquaintance of the Fisher family, mentioned that her husband had gone camping with Fisher in the area where the truck was found shortly before April 10th. She believed Fisher was familiar with the region and might have been scouting it out. The police had hoped that finding the car would quickly lead to his arrest, but as more time passed without any sign of him, the case grew colder. With the lack of new leads, the FBI eventually became involved, and in June 2001, Robert William Fisher was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list as the 475th person ever to be placed on it. The police believed that the increased publicity from being on the list, along with the coverage on shows like America's Most Wanted and The Hunt with John Walsh, would lead to his capture. By April 2003, the FBI had received hundreds and hundreds of leads. However, all reported sightings of Fisher have either been inconclusive or proven false.
He's a survivalist, that he's out there living in the woods.
To do that as an individual is usually a death card.
Professional survival instructor Cody Lundeen is as blunt as he is barefoot.
Hey, you've come here to talk to me about, is it possible for this guy to live off the land for 20 years? And my short answer is hell no.
For starters, investigators say there hasn't been any sign of someone living in the woods.
In 2009, a bizarre incident in Guatemala fueled speculation that Robert William Fisher might still be alive. A couple of tourists were taking photographs when a Caucasian male who was aggressive and visibly upset approached them. He demanded that they delete any pictures in which he might have appeared in the background. His behavior was so erratic and forceful that it drew the attention of the local police. The man's reaction seemed highly unusual, and his demeanor and actions matched some of Fisher's known tendencies. The second, and perhaps most well-known potential sighting of Fisher occurred in 2004 in White Rock, which is a suburb of Vancouver, Canada. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrested a man who they suspected was Fisher. The man had a missing tooth in the same spot where Fisher had a gold bicuspid, as well as a similar surgical scar on his back. Additionally, his age, height, and weight were almost identical to Fisher's at the time. Having found all these similarities, the RCMP contacted American authorities, who then conducted a fingerprint analysis.
I received a phone call from the Canadian police, who put me in touch with the person who ultimately became my client. He was in police custody.
Contrary to what they believed, the results definitively proved that the man was not Robert William Fisher. But even after the fingerprints cleared him, some of Fisher's former neighbors and people who knew him well were convinced that this man was indeed Fisher. His mother had to come forward with his birth certificate, family photographs, and other personal documents to definitively prove his identity and eliminate him as a suspect. Despite this, some newspapers reported that Fisher had been captured in Canada, which added unnecessary stress to the situation. Before Troy James Knapp, the notorious Utah cabin burglar, was identified and captured, many people speculated that he might be Robert William Fisher. Knapp, who is known for living off the grid and ransacking remote cabins, fit the image of someone like Fisher, who is believed to be capable of surviving in the wilderness. But this theory was also debunked when Knapp was conclusively identified as a different individual. In 2012, the FBI alerted local law enforcement that Fisher might have been living near where Mary's car was found. Then, in October 2014, police raided a house in Commerce City, Colorado, after receiving a tip that Fisher was hiding there. Although they arrested 2 people, they found no sign of him. Another lead emerged in Commerce City, Colorado, in October 2014. The tip seemed promising, enough for the police to launch an operation, but unfortunately, it did not lead to Fisher. However, the investigation did result in the arrest of 2 other criminals that the police had been searching for. To this day, Robert William Fisher remains at large, and no confirmed sightings of him have surfaced. But there are a lot of theories about his whereabouts. Some believe he may have taken his own life in the Tonto National Forest, where his wife's car was found, possibly in one of the many caves in the area. However, investigators and profilers generally discount this theory, arguing that Fisher's personality, which was marked by arrogance and a strong sense of self-preservation, would make suicide an unlikely outcome. On the 15th anniversary of the murders in April 2016, FBI officials and Scottsdale police held a news conference where they displayed age-enhanced photos of Fisher, hoping to reignite public interest in the case. On November 3, 2021, Fisher was removed from the FBI's 10 most wanted list. He was replaced by Julian Adonai Archega Carillas, the alleged leader of MS-13 in Honduras, and the 526th addition to the list. The FBI explained that despite the nearly 20 years of extensive publicity, Fisher's case had not resulted in his location or capture, meaning it no longer met the criteria for their list. But Fisher still remains a wanted fugitive. A lot of people think that he most likely survived and potentially started a new life under a fake identity. If this is the case, it is possible that Fisher died after years as a fugitive without his remains being identified. Another theory suggests that he might have used his survival skills to continue living in the wilderness near Payson, Arizona, where his wife's car was discovered. But the police and survival experts are skeptical of this due to the difficulty of finding food and shelter in that environment and the lack of evidence of anyone living in those woods. He could be living in a small town where he gets paid cash and works as a handyman, said Detective John Heinzelman. Or he could be in a big city and blend in.
He gets paid cash, or he could be living in a big town. You get lost in the shuffle.
Some suggest that Fisher might have crossed the southern border of the United States. His disappearance occurred before the September 11th attacks, when border security was less stringent, which makes this a possible scenario. Police have speculated that Fisher may have started a new family, and they are concerned that he might eventually decide to leave and murder that family as well, as one of their main reasons for continuing the search. Despite ongoing efforts, some law enforcement officials have concluded that they may never discover what happened to him. Maybe this is the best we have, knowing that he did it and never finding him again, said Detective Heinzelman. FBI agent Bob Caldwell described Fisher's personality as arrogant, he's cocky, he's a know-it-all, and a loner. Fisher is known to chew tobacco, especially the Copenhagen brand. His appearance has been described as average, but he sometimes walks in an odd, erect manner with his chest out, likely due to a back injury he sustained while working as a firefighter. Fisher is an avid hunter and fisherman and is considered armed and extremely dangerous, with possible ties to Florida and New Mexico. Do you think Fisher could be living under a new identity somewhere, or did he meet a tragic end in the wilderness? Could new evidence or a fresh tip finally bring Fisher to justice, or will this case remain a haunting mystery? Comment down below.
Now to that tragic story out of Santa Barbara. A surf shop owner accused of killing his 2 young children in Mexico. We are learning more details this morning. They're tough details, and this is a tough story. The FBI says 40-year-old Matthew Coleman confessed to killing his 2 children, 2-year-old son, 10-month-old daughter, with a spear gun before dumping their bodies.
The late 2010s saw a shocking rise in conspiracy theories across the U.S. Perhaps the most notorious of all was the QAnon theory, which suggests that the government is run by Satanists that abuse and devour babies, run a global child trafficking ring, and that want to topple Donald Trump's government. Today we're going to talk about one of the most heartbreaking incidents caused by the QAnon movement and its bizarre beliefs, the case of Matthew Taylor Coleman, also known as the QAnon Dad. It would have been bad enough if Coleman's 2 victims had been adults. As it turns out, they were infants, with the older of the pair being just 2 years old. And to make things even more twisted, they were Coleman's own children. We'll unpack this gruesome series of events that took Coleman and his 2 young children across the border to Mexico, where he dealt them a brutal fate. But first, we must understand the man he used to be and how unbelievable it was he'd do something like this. In 1981, John and Lori Coleman had their first child, a baby boy who they named Matthew, although most came to know him as Matty. The boy seemed to have had the perfect childhood in the sunny coastal city of Santa Barbara, where he learned to surf and ride dirt bikes. By all accounts, Coleman's childhood was almost perfect. He seemed to have no trouble mingling with the girls either, although he had some trouble understanding boundaries with them. In one incident during his teens, Coleman and another boy allegedly cornered a girl in an incident she saw as sexual harassment, indicating that he wasn't the well-adjusted child everyone thought him to be. Something dark lurked under the surface, but no one could see it just yet. However, Coleman seemed to change when he entered high school. He took a sudden interest in Christianity, an interest that was so intense that he could often be seen carrying around a Bible. This interest was no doubt encouraged by his parents, both of whom were devout Christians themselves. They considered Coleman to be a gift from God. Coleman's Christian streak only got more obsessive as he grew older. He decided to attend an evangelical college in San Diego and even went on missionary trips to foreign countries. One of these trips took him to Mexico, where he'd one day return to commit an unspeakable act of brutality against two innocents that saw him as their protector. Ironically, Coleman actually showed a profound, wholesome love for children at this stage in his life. According to John Harris, an assistant pastor at Shoreline Community Church, Coleman was always ready to help a child in need. He often helped them do their homework, though he also made sure to mentor them in the ways of the Bible. In all fairness, while Coleman definitely seemed very devout, he wasn't exactly radical in his beliefs. He just wanted to live a life of Christian values. One major aspect of this was starting a family, but Coleman didn't really find that special someone to settle down with until much later in life. Abby Drugsma was your typical all-American girl. Born and raised in Texas, Abby was the sort of person that always wanted to live by the Bible. She always wanted a good Christian man to start a family with, so she'd often go looking for suitors at church groups and other religious events. It was at one of these church groups that she ran into Matthew Coleman. Their chance encounter happened on January 8, 2017, and Abby was immediately attracted to the dashing, devout man who mentored kids in his spare time. They shared a passion for physical activity, with Abby frequently participating in CrossFit classes and encouraging others to get fit. At 36 years old, Coleman was a full 5 years older than Abby. This age gap might have seemed attractive to him because it gave him a sense of authority over the younger woman. Whatever the case may be, both of them found an instant connection and decided to get married not long after they met. It was around this time that the QAnon conspiracy started to take root, and over the next few years, it would poison and ultimately break Coleman's mind. Coleman wanted to live near a beach so he could keep surfing. Abby happened to love the beach too, so the couple rented a ranch house near Hendry Beach, a popular surfing site. This allowed Coleman to start up a surfing school, and once the money started coming in, the couple decided it was time to start a family. What Abby didn't realize was that her children would end up falling prey to their father's violent urges before too long. Their first child, a son they named Kaleo, was born in 2019. His little sister, Roxy, was born in late 2020. Neighbors reported that Abby was a good mother to the children, often taking them out on walks where she'd make sure to stop for a friendly chat with the people next door. Abby also loved baking banana bread for her neighbors, along with many other gestures of communal friendship. The picture the community paints of Abby is one of a loving mom, a friendly neighbor, and an all-around good person. Coleman wasn't seen in such a warm light because he usually kept to himself. But the couple shared a tendency to believe in conspiracy theories, and in 2020, something happened that kicked their dubious beliefs into high gear. The pandemic was a rough time for most people, but the Colemans actually did better than before. People needed outdoor activities for their kids that involved social distancing. Surfing usually doesn't involve getting close to other people. It's just you, your surfboard, and the waves. As a result, Coleman's business started booming during the lockdowns. But all was not well in his household. As we've already mentioned, his wife was rather gullible and quickly believed false narratives about the world. For one thing, she was known to be a part of Facebook groups that promoted anti-vaxxing theories. She believed, without any evidence, that the vaccines being made for COVID were somehow dangerous. This was a belief that ran in her family as well, with her family members posting to Facebook about how the pandemic was a planned conspiracy and how the Democratic Party was run by Satanists. As for Coleman, his belief in conspiracy theories had already taken root by the time he settled down. He seemed to believe in something called the Great Awakening, a conspiracy theory that Donald Trump was going to arrest the supposed child abusers and traffickers that controlled the country and restore America to greatness. These beliefs also affected how he saw his children. He felt that Roxy was being born at a time of great change, that she'd see a new dawn emerge in the country. But at the same time, he thought that the government might be run by powerful, demonic figures that started making him extremely paranoid.
There has been an awakening. Have you felt it?
Supporters of QAnon were out in full force at President.
By the summer of 2021, Coleman firmly believed everything that the QAnon conspiracy suggested. He knew in his heart that Donald Trump was fighting a group of child abusers and traffickers, and that he was going to bring about an era of change. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Abby was also part of his descent into the world of conspiracy. She apparently believed in QAnon as well, which seemed to be a trend among evangelical Christians. Even so, Abby had stated that her husband took things to a whole other level. All of a sudden, everything seemed like a conspiracy to Coleman. More importantly, everything started to seem like a threat. He started noticing people making hand gestures, which he saw as secret signals to harm him and his family. And when he noticed his own friends making the same gestures, he became convinced that they were out to get him too. It is important to note that these gestures could be as simple as making the peace sign. To Coleman's fracturing mind, these common gestures were directed threats to him, and he believed that he needed to take drastic measures. And it wasn't just his family he was worried about either. At some point during 2021, Coleman started to believe that he might just be the only sane person on the planet. Everyone seemed insane to him. Nobody was taking his concerns seriously, not even Abby, who later said that he was taking things too far. In early August of that year, the Colemans decided to plan a family trip. They needed to get out of town and go somewhere they'd feel safe. For Coleman, the walls seemed to be closing in. Everyone was his enemy, especially his friends. He started taking screenshots on social media of every individual making one of these so-called secret hand gestures. That's when he found a picture of his friend holding up the peace sign and became convinced that he was being set up. Coleman was completely divorced from reality by this point. In his view, the devil worshippers in Washington were trying to get to him, and they'd gone so far as to recruit his friends to do it. It's important to know that he broke off contact with many people he'd known since childhood, all because he thought they were trying to plan something evil against him. And if that wasn't enough, Coleman's obsessions with conspiracy theories wasn't just restricted to QAnon. He also started to look into older and more bizarre theories that suggested the whole world was run by a shadow organization of lizard people. These were not the thoughts of a rational man. Indeed, these thoughts belonged to a man who was a danger to everybody, including himself, and particularly his own family. As the family prepared for their trip, Coleman started getting some truly devastating, intrusive thoughts. If his friends were in on the conspiracy, who else might be involved? Could his own wife be working against him as well? And what about his children? An analysis of Coleman's behavior in the lead up to the incident suggests that his thoughts were racing, and he was having trouble seeing things clearly. All he knew was that he had to do something. And on the morning of August 7th, he decided to take action. Abby was busy packing for the family trip that morning. The sun was bright, the weather was great, and she was looking forward to spending some quality time with her husband and children. It was at this point that Coleman picked up both his kids and put them in his car and drove off without a word. Abby was understandably concerned. This was extremely erratic behavior from her husband. He hadn't even taken the children's car seats, indicating that he'd left in a frantic rush. She immediately phoned the police, but clarified that she didn't believe the children were in danger. After all, how could her good Christian husband hurt any child, let alone his own? She was wrong, of course, but then again, Abby was wrong about many things. Hours after Coleman departed, the friend he'd accused of using secret hand gestures came over. He may have wanted to offer his friend's wife some comfort at this time, but the reaction he got was shocking to say the least. Instead of welcoming this family friend into the home, Abby pulled out a picture from 10 years ago where his unnamed friend was making the supposed secret gesture. She then accused him of being in on the whole conspiracy and kicked him out of the house. During this whole time, Coleman was driving further and further away from his Santa Barbara home. He was headed for Mexico, where the bloody climax of this tale will take place. Coleman and his children arrived in Mexico on August 8th. The culprit booked a hotel room, and as he lay in bed, all the pieces started to come together. He claimed that he saw the whole web of conspiracy like code in the Matrix. He felt like Neo when he could see the computer construct for what it truly was. But one of the pieces of hallucinatory code that floated before Coleman's views sent a chill down his spine. He realized that his wife must be in on it. She must be part of the lizard people harming kids across the country. And if she was a lizard person, that meant that she'd passed her serpent DNA onto their children. In this complete break from reality, Coleman knew that there was only one thing he could do. No matter how much he loved his children, he couldn't allow them to grow up and become the mutant alien monsters that he believed were controlling the world. You might think that Coleman was completely isolated at this point, but you'd be wrong. He and Abby had been texting the whole time, although he gave no indication that he'd found out about her supposed connection to the lizard people. His wife told him that she missed him and that she'd found comfort while reading his grandmother's old Bible. In response, Coleman said, "Hi babe, miss you too. Things have been rough but starting to get some clarity as well. Still confused on a lot of things though and processing through them. So many crazy thoughts going through my head right now, hard to explain. Yeah, funny you're getting some clarity through my grandma's old Bibles. Wasn't there two? Anyways, was actually still thinking of burning them in case there's a chip in them or something. Going to keep processing through everything and hope to get some answers. Hope all this craziness ends soon. Love you." These messages, which were exchanged at 3:12 a.m., clearly show that Coleman was past the point of no return. 2 hours later, he'd commit one of the most unimaginably cold-blooded acts anyone could perform. At around 5 a.m., as dawn started breaking over the Mexican horizon, Coleman drove his children to a nearby ranch. The open fields were calm at that time of day and quiet. Coleman parked his car and took his children out, along with a certain item that he intended to use. This item was a spearfishing gun, and its razor-sharp point must have glinted in the dim light, right before it would be covered in the thick, red blood of its victims. Kaleo and Roxy were 2 years and 11 months old respectively. Coleman would have had to carry Roxy out of the car since she was too young to walk. As for Kaleo, he'd probably recently learned to walk, so there's a chance that he just toddled along behind his father. He trusted him. Why wouldn't he? This was the man that had protected him all his life. There's no way to know exactly how the next few minutes went down. All we can say for sure is this: Coleman picked up his spearfishing gun and started wildly stabbing at his children. Kaleo was stabbed 17 times and Roxy was stabbed 12 times, all in the chest. They died on the spot, but Coleman didn't seem to feel any remorse for his actions. Instead, he just hid their bodies under some nearby brush, got back in his car, and made for the U.S.-Mexico border. Not long after, 47-year-old Roberto Salinas Ramirez woke up on his farm. When he headed out, his neighbor told him he'd seen a massive amount of blood right outside his home. Roberto saw the blood and started investigating. It took him a while to find the bodies under the willow brush. They were tiny and pale, difficult to spot in the rocky ground. Both children were naked except for their diapers. Shaken and distraught, Roberto called the police. Hundreds of miles away in Santa Barbara, Abby finally decided to file a missing persons report after not hearing from her husband that morning. During this time, Coleman approached the border, where he was stopped for a security check. When border agents found blood in his van, they immediately took him into custody and called the FBI. Agents soon arrived, and Coleman started confessing his gruesome crimes. He told them his fears about his wife's serpent DNA and that his children might have been infected by it. He told them everything, and the FBI agents couldn't do much but listen to the horrific story. Coleman was on the hook for the homicide of U.S. nationals on foreign soil. He pleaded not guilty, and after a psychological evaluation, a judge deemed him mentally incompetent to stand trial in October of 2023. Instead, it appears that Coleman will be sentenced to mandatory psychiatric treatment. However, Coleman's descent into madness didn't stop while he was in federal lockup. Reports suggest that he repeatedly tries to harm himself with razor blades, forcing prison officials to medicate him against his will. While he awaits a hearing that will transfer him from federal lockup to a psychiatric facility, he was to grapple with what he'd done. Meanwhile, Abby's life is now completely destroyed, but she's managed to profit from the death of her children. A GoFundMe set up in their name reportedly received over $100,000 in donations. But no matter how much money she receives, Abby will have to live with the fact that she encouraged Coleman to go deeper into the conspiracy pit, and that her children's lives were horrifically ended as a result. What do you think of this case? Do you think Matthew Taylor Coleman deserved to go to jail, or perhaps even the death penalty? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more videos like this, please be sure to like the video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on more true crime videos. See you in the next one.